Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Jonathan Beauchamp. Hello, Jonathan. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you doing?
I'm great, Jonathan. Jonathan, I love George Mason University. I've interviewed so many of your colleagues on this show. George GMU has some really brilliant minds. Don't
I
you
agree.
agree?
I agree. I'm very fortunate and happy to be here.
My God, like the research is just so interesting. So, Jonathan, how do you describe your research? What's the link between genes and economics?
That's a good question. Well, there's two parts to the question. So first, in terms of how I would describe my research, I would say there's uh, two main components right now that keep me busy. The first one, or three, I would say. There's genoeconomics is the first one. The second one is what I'd call applied genoeconomics, which is bringing gene and genoeconomic finding into economics. And the first component about genoeconomics, about discovering genetic variants that are associated with traits of interest to economists, and also understanding how these interact with the environment and so on. So that's the first component. Second one, as I said, is applying this to traditional question of interest to economists that might not care about genetics, but that might care about the fact that genetic data can help answer questions. And then the third big bucket of my research is what I'd called cultural economics, and in particular, I'm very interested in the role of kin-based institutions, which how it relates to psychology and economic outcomes and politics and everything. Really, kin-based institutions is the range of norms related to how people relate to their kins in a broad sense. So basically marriage, cousin marriage, residence, extended family residence, segmented lineage, polygamy, all these things basically.
Yes,
And
I've been following the research on kinship ties. I interviewed one of your co-authors some time ago.
oh, nice.
Yes.
Dr. Schultz?
No, not Dr. Schultz, Dr. Rad.
Oh, yeah, Duman, yes.
Yeah, yes, I
Yeah.
interviewed him some time ago. We discussed many of his articles on kin-based institutions, and I am really interested in the literature on individualism and its social correlates. So, for example, the relationship between individualism and long-term orientation and innovation and institutional
Yes.
quality. I'm a very big consumer of that literature.
Yeah,
Jonathan,
it is fascinating. Yeah.
Jonathan, when people say that traits are hereditary, that
Mhm.
statement is quite obvious, but how is it measured? So one of your studies argued that genetic variants are associated with educational attainment. How do you measure the data? I want our listeners to really
Yeah.
understand the research.
Absolutely. So, well, there's two variables here when we say genetic variants associated with educational attainment. So, on one end, you have the genetic variants, and well, in a way, that's pretty straightforward. But let's unpack that. And so we have 3.1 billion base pairs, if you want, or elements in the DNA. And we have this from the mother and this from the father as well, spread out over 23 chromosomes. And so we don't study all of these variants yet. Well, at least now they're sequencing data. We can do that. What we've been dealing with so far is genotype data, which is a subset of several million point variants, which we call SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphism. So we're looking for links between those single nucleotide polymorphism and the phenotype or the trait of interest, in this case, educational attainment. And the way we define educational attainment is simply the number of years of education one has. So basically, if one has completed high school, depending on what country you're in, it's about 12 years, or sometimes it's 13. If someone has gone to a college degree and has completed it, that's 4 more years, so 16 years. If one has a master, then you add, and so on. So basically, you count number of years of education. It turns out in the economics literature that number of years of education is a very important predictor, or correlate, if you want, of all type of things, ranging from income to happiness, marital stability, and pretty much everything, health. So then we find several SNPs that are associated, SNPs being the genetic variants we care about. We find a few of them that are associated with educational attainment. And when I say a few of them, well, it depends when. When we started, we had smaller sample size. And we found just 3 in the first paper that was published in Science 2013. Now, in the 4th large-scale study of the genetics of educational attainment, which was published in Nature Genetics this year, in 2022, a few months ago, we found 3,000, if I remember well, it's 3 or 4,000. I don't even keep count anymore. Variants associated with educational attainments.
And these variants that are associated with educational attainment, they're genetic. And many of us are interested in the genetic correlates of intelligence and the drivers of intelligence. So if one person or a group of people, let's say for example, some people are more intelligent than others based on your research, what would be what would be the driving factor behind that higher level of intelligence?
Yeah, well, if you think intelligence, like any trait, like height or BMI or education or blood lipid levels or whatever, they're influenced by both genetic and environmental influences. And the question is how much of it is genetic and how much of it is environmental. And then you can also have, if you do a full variance decomposition of the population, you could have a very simple model just decompose between genetic, family environment, or noise, or like random noise of family environment. But you can have more sophisticated decomposition that looks at gene environment correlation, which is a better model of reality because genes and environment are correlated. So what drives differences between people? Well, it's a mixture of all these things. And for height, for instance, there's much more importance of genetics in the current time period. But for traits like education, then genetics is still very important, but environment also has a very big role. And for intelligence, well, the decomposition that I've seen on the literature suggests, based on twin studies, for instance, suggests that genes matter for maybe in Western population, with several caveats, range genetics influences maybe 50 to 80%, I think. People disagree on the point estimate, but they all agree that genetics is pretty important. So that's for variation within group. Between group, it's much more complicated. There's basically current research. There's not much that can be said based on the type of research that's being done. I've been doing based on group differences, at least if you mean ancestry group differences. If you mean in socioeconomic status group differences, then in principle within a given population, again that's a bit the same as the question as within group difference, like it's a mixture of gene, environment, and so on.
Jonathan, in 2016, you published an interesting paper that's frequently cited titled Genetic Evidence for Natural Selection in Humans in the Contemporary United States. What's this paper about?
Yes, that's one of my favorite papers that I've done. So this was published in PNAS 2016. So, well, this is basically looking at whether natural selection is still occurring in humans, or more specifically, among Americans born between the birth year, I think it's 1931 to 1953. So it's for Americans who were born in 1931 to 1953, who were recruited to be enrolled in the Health and Retirement Study, which is a US data set that aims to be representative of the US population. Of course, it's never perfectly representative, but it aims to be. And so what that paper looked at is whether, what I did basically is, what that paper looked at is whether genes that are correlated, possibly in part, largely causally, but let's put that question to the side for now. So genes that are correlated with various traits, including education attainment, age at menarche, glucose concentration, schizophrenia, height, BMI, some other, whether these genes that are, or rather, I say genes, but what I mean is really SNPs for single nucleotide polymorphism that are correlated with these traits. That paper looks whether those SNPs are also correlated with fertility, or rather differential fertility. So meaning, do people who have SNPs that are associated with higher educational attainment tend to also have higher, more babies, basically, higher fertility? And at the core of the paper is really what this is. It's looking whether, and it finds that SNPs that are associated with more educational attainment or associated with people having fewer babies relative to others in their cohort. And that's basically the finding. Now, put this into a framework. There's the Robertson-Price identity, which is a famous identity in evolutionary theory, that basically states that the genetic covariance between a trait in this case, educational attainment, for instance, and fitness, in this case, the relative number of babies that we measure in our case, fitness as relative number of babies relative to your cohort. So that genetic covariance between educational attainment and relative fitness is going to be equal to the evolutionary change in a cohort, basically. So all this to say that our paper suggests that educational attainment has been decreasing genetically for that cohort in the US that we study at the rate, if I remember well, it's something like 1 month or 1.5 months of education per generation. And why is that interesting? Well, first, it's very cool to see that natural selection is still occurring in humans. You know, I mean, there's lots of reasons to believe it should be occurring in humans. Like, actually, there's very few reasons to believe it has stopped. But despite that, many people, you know, still today, but especially until a few decades ago, were stating that, like Stephen Jay Gould famously said, you know, that and the one thing that, like, I'm forgetting which one exactly, but basically that human evolution stopped 40 or 50,000 years ago, and that now it's just been cultural evolution. But there's really no reason to believe that. So evolution is occurring now, and so it's fascinating. It's a fascinating field of study to see what's been going on with humans recently, and what's going to go on with us evolutionarily over the coming years. Yeah, so that's what the paper is about in a nutshell.
I'm interested in evolution and life history strategies. Some time ago, I read an academic article on the life history strategy of various groups in America, but it was not directly related to intelligence. Are there papers examining the link between life history and intelligence? I've been looking for some of them.
That's a good question. So that's not really something literature I'm an expert in, but it's a very interesting question. I'm not. That would be. I would say I already ventured outside of my training for that paper on contemporary evolution or natural selection, which I find fascinating. But I think now you're stretching the bound of my knowledge even further. So I'll pass this.
Well, Jonathan, that's exactly the point. I know that many people are not studying this particular area of research, and I'm wondering why. Because it would really allow us to unravel some of the mysteries. Groups respond to their ecologies. So are the gaps in IQ a function of one's responsiveness to a particular ecology? People should study that topic. I shouldn't be
Yeah,
speculating.
it is a fascinating topic. I agree. Well, I mean, I think you're mentioning IQ, but IQ is a very interesting trait that has gotten, you know, lots of attention, and is indeed a very important trait. But, you know, what you're saying applies to all traits. Any trait. Take a trait that's less like blood glucose concentration, for instance, or fasting glucose concentration is the name of the trait. It has evolved differently in different places depending on different ecology, and yeah, so it's a fascinating topic. It's unfortunately not one that I have had the time to ponder as much as you know the topic would warrant.
Yeah, many people are not pondering that topic. It's just like a paper that said some time ago, genes, the environment alters the expression of genes. It was written in a clear manner so that ordinary people could read it, but many of these papers don't identify the exact causal mechanism. So by reading such papers, we cannot then infer that because of a particular culture, there's a stronger selection for X or Y traits. So again, the causal mechanisms in many of these studies are not quite clear.
Well, there's lots of progress in this, not on the topic of IQ, but the famous researcher, I think the one of the leading researchers in that field is called Kevin Leland or Laland. I don't
Yes,
know
I
the
know of
pronunciation.
him. Yes.
Yeah, so he's done lots of work on this. And for instance, well, I mean, again, I'm getting a bit outside of my specific expertise here. So people like him have done lots of research. I don't know if it's him exactly who did this one, but the research on the evolution of blue eyes, of white skin color, resistance to malaria with sickle and sickle cell anemia mutation, adaptation to high altitude. One of the most interesting one has been lactase persistence. The fact that and this has evolved in more than one place in the world separately, that people have developed enzymes to still be able to digest milk after weaning, so that they could basically herd cattle and not just have to do the labor-intensive process of transforming their milk into cheese or curd or yogurt, which, if I understand well, that's what they had to do before. So now they could drink the milk directly, and that was a huge source of protein, and that they found that was so obviously that co-evolved with the culture for herding, because they were doing herding first for cheese and curd and other dairy products that they had to transform, and then so yeah, there's lots of work in that area. Unfortunately, I'm not on top of it.
Yeah, I know many of those studies are really exploring how the environment can directly shape social traits and social outcomes. So there's this paper. It's interesting, but not that famous, on the link between dairy culture and freedom. Yes, yes.
Who wrote that paper? Is that
A Dutch academic, and
okay?
his co-author, his name is Van de Vleert. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
mispronounce his name. Yeah, Eric Van de Vleert.
Okay, yeah. If you don't mind sending me, I should look this up. Yeah,
He wrote that paper.
Yeah, there's a whole in the back to economics, which I know better. There's a whole study about the long run, the long roots,
Deep roots of development. Yes.
Yeah, and my own work on case-based institutions aims to look into this, basically, that we find, so that we have a paper published with Joe Henrich, Duman, Baramy Rad, who we mentioned earlier, and Jonathan Schultz, published in Science 2019, where we look at how kin-based institutions, which I mentioned briefly earlier, it's basically how kin norms are govern, one's relation to kins, marriage, and so on, how these relate to a whole range of cultural psychological traits. These include individualism, collectivism, public good contribution, conformity and obedience, prosociality, various measures of prosociality, and so on. And that goes to this in the sense that these institutions, kin-based institutions, are very deep rooted, and in the sense they don't change easily over time. They do change, but your ancestors' kin-based institutions are a good predictor of your kin-based institutions. Not perfect, but so that's fascinating area of work.
Yes, I'm really interested in the deep roots of development, although I believe that some of the papers are quite a stretch.
Yes, I think. Well, that whenever you, I think, in economics and social sciences, you always have a choice between having a very precise paper with a very clear identification strategy and finding a very clean result. But often that comes at the price of having to tackle a smaller and very well-defined question. So whenever you go to tackle very big questions about how the world works, and big correlates between culture and values and things like that, inevitably it's hard to have the same empirical standards as if you go to a very small, more better defined question.
Jonathan, I read the paper on kinship, institutions, and democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Schultz wrote that paper. Were you also a co-author?
I was not, but I read that paper closely.
Okay, yeah. Yes. So for those of us who don't know, that paper was looking at the link between kinship institutions and democracy, or rather how the solution of kinship institutions promoted democracy.
That's correct. Yeah. No, it's a very good paper. I read it closely more than once. It's basically that's like, so kin-based institutions are related to everything, essentially. So everything, and not every, that's no, obviously related to a lot of things. So in the first paper, we looked at the link to cultural psychological variables, and how the Catholic Church, what became the Catholic Church, ultimately affected kin-based institution upstream. And then Jonathan Schultz has looked at this link with participatory democratic institutions, and especially focusing on cousin marriage, but also looking at kin-based institutions, but it's focused cousin marriage. And then we have another very big project that we're about, hopefully, to post a working paper soon on, about kin-based institutions' economic outcome. And so in that paper, that latter paper, we look at how kin-based institutions relate to economic prosperity, basically. And we find that, so we define, well, following the anthropological literature, we use the concept of kinship intensity. So that tells us whether one's population or society as institutions that are associated with institutions associated with more intensive forms of kinship, such as more cousin marriage, more polygamy, extended household and co-residence, and so on, and segmented lineage. These are all, they all have the effect of reinforcing links with your kin. On the other side, you have institutions that are more extensive in nature for kin-based intensity, such as those we find in the West, where we have people have love-based marriage with strangers as opposed to cousin marriage or even band. There's no polygamy, there's neolocality, and so on. So basically, we find that kinship intensity is associated with lower prosperity across the world, and it holds within country. And so, yeah, so basically, yeah, kin-based institutions are important, and I think they're finally starting to get more attention.
Jonathan, city air makes you free. This statement was actually tested and proven some years ago by foreign researchers, and I'm wondering about decentralization. Decentralization should promote more individual autonomy. So does it also mean that decentralized groups are more individualistic? And I'm asking this question in the context of the Igbo people of Nigeria. Africans are collectivistic, but the Igbos are more individualistic than other Africans, and they also have decentralized communities. So it is often said, in Igbo land, there is no king, or there's a king in every man, because they value autonomy.
That's very interesting. I was not afraid. I was not aware of that characteristic of the Igbo people. But yes, that is. I mean, you know, speculatively here, I do think that this makes sense. That, you know, just intuitively, that like peoples that have norms that vary, that favor more autonomy and more you know, less intensive kinship and so on, will be associated with, well, definitely. In our science paper, we find link between lower kinship intensity, meaning more extensive kinship, and individualism and so on. So yeah, no, that's interesting.
And what about exogamy? Have you done a study on the link between exogamy and innovation? So do groups innovate more when they marry outside of the immediate group?
That's a good question. So so in our paper from Science, and the one that I mentioned that's not being posted yet on kin-based institution and economic development, we used one metric one variable that we call the kinship intensity index to measure the kinship intensity of a group. And so that index has 5 components. One of which is a subcomponent that's basically community endogamy and you know, living in co-residence. So the community endogamy component captures that basically. So what we do find is that the whole, when you regress measures of economic development on the whole KII, or kinship intensity index, you do find a negative association. So, and endogamy is one of the 5 subcomponent, or rather a subcomponent of one of 5 subcomponents of the KI. So we, in one of the regression table of the paper that's not been posted yet on GDP, we look at each of the 5 subcomponents. So I'd have to look right now, but generally they're all negatively associated with development as well. So I'd give you a tentative yes, it's definitely consistent with everything we find. We haven't looked at exogamy specifically, but we've looked at it as part of our KII.
Yeah, Joseph Enrich, his book Weird has illuminated our understanding of individualism. So Joseph's book is really, as well, I'm sure that you have read it, or at least you know of it, but it's really chronicling the Western story using the trait of individualism. But I have discovered that individualism correlates positively with so many traits, from trust to innovation, to donation, as you said earlier, so many traits. So intuitively, people might assume that individualistic societies are corrupt, but they're actually known for good governance, because if you're individualistic, you're not going to do business with people based on kinship ties.
Yeah, well, you're right that individualism correlates with a lot of things, and the challenge is always to see what's the upstream variable, what's the variable that causes all this? Basically, is it individualism that causes everything else, or is there something else that causes individualism, and what causes that something else, and so on? So you're fully right. Now, and you're right also that individualism generally is correlated with lower measures of corruption and high measures of transparency and so on. So in our science paper, like the one with the other one on kin-based institutions, with Henrich, Schultz, and Duman, we basically look, what our story basically is that kin-based institutions is the big kind of upstream variable that affects cultural psychology, including individualism, including transparency, corruption, and so on. And then we have another layer to this, saying that, of course, what causes kin-based institutions? So, I mean, obviously, biogeographic variables, the environment in which people, different population, culturally and otherwise evolved, and then the big layer we add to this is the Catholic Church, or what became the Catholic Church. We present lots of evidence that the Church basically dismantled the European kin-based institutions through the Middle Ages, basically. So all this to say, yes, individualism correlates with lots of things, but the question is, what's the story that leads to that correlation?
Well, Joseph wrote a really excellent book, but we still don't know the direct evolution of individualism. Some people attribute it to German culture and other variables. We still don't really know why Westerners are really individualistic. We know there's a relationship between the medieval church and individualism, but even before the advent of the medieval church, people in the West were still more individualistic.
Yeah. Well, that's a question. There's no data is still sparse on this. So, I mean, our paper, our main mechanism for the lower individualism we see in the West is that we argue is that the church dismantled kin-based institution in the West, and those kin-based institution in turn were like intensive kinship is what reduces levels of individualism. So as a result of the church dismantling of those institutions, then the West became more individualistic. Now, there's other theories that are consistent with this story, or that are alternatives to the story. So you could say some people have argued that the West used to be more individualistic before even the church. And the problem here is that the data is still rather sparse. Doesn't mean non-existent. So I think a lot of progress will be done on that question in the coming decades. Like there's lots of textual corpus data that can be mined with like AI tools or informatic tools to see whether the signs and pronouns used or just literally whatever was written to suggest that people in the West were more individualistic. Although obviously that type of data will represent the data of those who could write, not the whole population. But yes, there's it could be that people in the West were already more individualistic prior to the church, and the church made them even more so by dismantling their kin-based institutions. Or it could be that it was just the church that arrived and dismantled these. And then, so I think, the position we take in the science paper is that was the latter story, but it doesn't really rule out fully other influences before independently.
Jonathan, I want you to tell us about your response to Michael Woodley of Meany.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you mean for PNAS?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I have to remember a bit.
So Michael Woodley of Meany is an ecologist and intelligence researcher, and he's arguing that intelligence is declining, but you are arguing that culture is driving a selection for educational attainment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm pulling out his response now. I remember that correspondence that was 6 years ago. So if I remember well, what Woodley of Meany argued in PNAS in his letter was basically that what explained, so that's back to the PNAS paper on ongoing selection in the US. So in the paper, I find that there's a genetic covariance, negative genetic covariance between educational attainment and relative fertility. And Woodley of Meany said this is likely driven, if I remember well, he said this is likely driven by a covariance between IQ, that IQ is the component of EA that's being selected against. And the other thing, I think his other point was that there's about the environmental override. I have to remember the details. I'm sorry. Well, let me comment on the first point. So the fact that IQ drives the selection against education, well, that's possible. My sense is it's not at all. It's not what's driving this only. At least it's possible there's direct selection against IQ. It's possible, but it's definitely compatible with the results I got. I think more likely is that people who get more education tend to postpone fertility. They tend to postpone marriage and having kids. And as such, if you start having kids at age 30 or 35, well, you'll have on average fewer kids than if you start having kids at age 25. And
Jonathan,
so that's very,
let me read what you said. You said, first, there is nothing paradoxical about my findings. Phenotypes arise from the interplay of genetic and environmental factors, and environmental factors can induce phenotypic changes that run counter to those induced by natural selection.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, that's what you said, because I read Woodley quite a bit, and his argument is that IQ is declining and IQ tests are measuring specific components of G. That's his argument. They're measuring specific cognitive ability and not necessarily general ability.
Oh, so he's arguing that IQ tests are testing specific cognitive ability?
Specific cognitive abilities, not necessarily general ability. So Woodley is really controversial, and I like controversial writers. That's why the Woodley reply was on the top of my mind. I'm like, Woodley's so controversial. This is something that you must remember.
But I don't think Woodley and I very much disagree on substance here. Well, except for I think my response was mainly about clarifying the fact that my results. Let me pull up his letter, if I may. I'll try to do that in real time here, because if I remember well, his point was that a lot of the results I found between correlation between educational attainment and fertility was driven by okay, I got it here. Was driven by IQ. And I think it's possible that IQ is being directly selected in, but compared to the effect of the very visible in education that people postpone fertility and people with more education postpone fertility. So it's kind of an obvious mechanism there, which in turn may have effect on IQ. Well, probably does actually. So he says Beauchamp treats educational attainment as if it were the target of selection, which is problematic. Education attainment is better conceptualized as an outcome that arises from facultative calibration over childhood in response to various things, including IQ, with which it shares 60% of its genetic variance. Yeah, so I think on this point we disagree, basically. So I don't treat educational attainment as if it were the target of selection. My paper is not about, didn't say anything about what's the target of selection. My paper was about saying that genes for educational attainment happen to be correlated with lower fertility, relative fertility, which means there is natural selection occurring for natural education attainment. Now, that could be, as Woodley argues, that could be because IQ is the target of selection and education attainment is correlated with it. But it could also be because education attainment itself is a target of selection via the mechanism that I outlined, that people who get more education tend to postpone fertility, marriage, and so on. So basically, I think more data. Neither I nor Woodley of many have strong data to defend what we think is the right story in terms of what's the target of selection. I think we both agree that genes that correlate with education attainment are being selected against. That's very likely to mean that IQ as well is being selected against. I think there's separate evidence for that, anyways. But I think I was reacting to a statement that I treat education attainment as the target of selection, which I don't, and then what else does he say? Yeah, and then that thing you cited from myself in my response. The thing about the fact that there's not really a paradox about the fact that genes are selected one way, why environment pushes in the other way. I think that can happen for various reasons, and it's not really a big puzzle. I think it's almost surely what's going on in the case of education, that basically there's a secular increase in the level of education through time, as many people keep going to get more and more education. But at the same time, those people who get more education among a given cohort tend to postpone fertility, and as such, they end up having fewer kids. At least that's a mechanism I would guess, although, yeah.
All right. So, Jonathan, thanks for showing up. I'm really enjoying the conversation, but unfortunately, I have to wrap up. But I'm going to send you that email on the link between dairy and freedom.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Lipton.
All
It was a
right.
pleasure.
Bye, Jonathan.
Bye.